Hello. Same. I I finally finished world building the films that are released in 1939 for Tinseltown. I still have to decide the awards for 1939, but I finally made up all the movies. This is painful. Every year, there's more. Like, the further and further I go down this timeline, and because I've decided to make it more detailed, there's more and more. It's more. Every single year gets more and more. There are more and more films I have to make. I am in pain.
You do realize this is something that you've done to yourself.
Sympathy, support, love. These are the things I ask for.
And they're the things you will get, but as long as you admit that you did this to yourself.
Do you know how many whole ass movies I had to make up for this year? Like, not just, oh, I changed the casting for this movie, oh, I changed the director. No, 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 no. Entire movies, just completely, I had to make up the entire cast and crew because they did not exist in our timeline, but in this timeline, they would. Either because a change in the career of an actor I made 10 years ago, or because I just think it's interesting and so I decided to make it happen. Do you know how many movies I had to make up for this year?
122.
No, Jesus, no. Good Lord, no.
25.
Close. 23.
Eh.
Don't because that means I have for 23 different movies. I have to scrounge through cast listings, crew listings of various studio films that actually released in our timeline and try to figure out how they might have gone in the alternate timeline. What would have made the most possible sense given the premises of these possible films? 23. 23 films, babe. Would you like to hear those films?
It sounds like I'm gonna hear them.
You're gonna hear them anyway because I put a lot of work into them, okay? And I'm tired. And it's 1939, and I'm only 25 years into this alternate timeline, babe, and I'm in pain. I'm in pain. 23 made up films. So those films that we have for Tinseltown, we have a Cinderella movie starring Judy Garland instead of Wizard of Oz because she's not going to MGM, she's going to Universal. So I had to give her a completely different movie, and I needed to give her some vehicle in 1939 to continue like some parallel of her career. So I gave her a Cinderella movie in 1939. We have Kim, which is an adventure film about like this boy in India. It's like in the same lines as Jungle Book, but not quite. Anyways, this one was one that was actually being considered and almost was made in 1939, but wasn't, and so I've decided to have it be made in 1939. I didn't have to, but I decided I was going to because don't worry about it. Anyways, it stars Freddie Bartholomew. We have Kim. And it's directed by Victor Fleming because he's not directing Wizard of Oz, so it makes sense to give him something else in 1939. Then we have Applause, which is a remake of the prior 1929 film, and this one again, like it was being considered in 1939 that there would be an Applause remake starring Marlene Dietrich and Ann Miller. So I've decided, no, was it Ann Miller? I don't know if Ann Miller was actually being considered. I put Ann Miller as the actress here, but I can't remember if she was actually being considered or if I just needed someone to fill that role. Anyways, it was originally going to star Marlene Dietrich in 1939. Marlene Dietrich doesn't have an American career in this timeline, but I still wanted to go with that possible Applause remake in 1939. So Bridget Helm is starring in it because in this timeline, it was Bridget Helm who starred in Sternberg's films, not Marlene Dietrich. So I had to put Bridget Helm in there as Kitty Darling instead. Then we have War Eagles. War Eagles is actually this really cool film that Willis O'Brien wanted to make in the 1930s, but he couldn't because of World War II. And it was basically like Vikings fighting Nazis in New York City. Vikings on pterodactyls fighting Nazis. No, sorry. The pterodactyls are like giant eagles. Both, I think. Fighting Nazis over New York City. That was the whole movie. It's just Vikings fighting Nazis, because why not? He didn't make it, and that's a tragedy, because, like, I genuinely think it might have been, like, one of the best movies ever if he made it. So I decided that he's gonna make it in this timeline for the fun of it. Then we have The Prophet, which is based off, like, this opera, this French opera, and it's from Abel Gance, the guy who did Napoleon. And I had to give him something in 1939 because in this timeline, his 9-hour cut of Napoleon actually premieres in theaters and isn't cut to hell and back again. Because I wanted to give him, I wanted him to have nice things. He deserves nice things. So anyways, I gave him The Prophet in 1939. Then we have The Land from Robert J. Flaherty, which is just a documentary about American agriculture. He was going to make that, but then he didn't. Just for political reasons, he ended up not making it. But he did in this timeline. That one was actually pretty... I just needed to... He's directing it, and I just need to figure out what day it released, that's all. But still, you know, I had to make a whole movie, okay? Then we have The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's a Universal Monsters film because I completely altered the direction of the Universal Monsters in the 1920s and 30s. They're not actually called the Universal Monsters in this timeline. They're the Universal Gothic films, and it's just adaptations of Gothic horror novels. Because Frankenstein bombed at the box office in this timeline. And so they went in a completely different direction. So we have a Legend of Sleepy Hollow film in 1939 because I needed some Gothic novel adapted in 1939. And I decided to go with Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It stars Vincent Price. He plays Ichabod Crane. Then we have Heart of Darkness, which is a Heart of Darkness adaptation that Orson Welles wanted to do as his debut film instead of Citizen Kane. He wasn't gonna, like, Citizen Kane came after because Heart of Darkness didn't work out because the budget for Heart of Darkness would have been too big. But in this timeline, Orson Welles has been nominated for, like, several Tonys because the Tonys exist in this timeline and in 1939 and they didn't in our timeline. And he's even been nominated for, like, 2 Grammys because I also pushed the Grammys back like 20 years. So Orson Welles was able to command a bigger budget for his debut film as a result. So he goes with his Heart of Darkness film, and it's considered like one of the best films of all time because I think it would have been fascinating if he actually did make his Heart of Darkness. He wanted to make it in first-person point of view? Like, he wanted the entire film to be from the first-person perspective of Charles Marlowe, and Orson Welles himself was going to play Charles Marlowe and Mr. Kurtz. And Mr. Kurtz. But he didn't, because he didn't make the movie, and I think that's a tragedy. And so he does in this timeline. It's going to get nominated for Best Picture, and it's not going to win, and it's going to be considered one of the biggest snubs in Oscar history in Tinseltown. Just like Citizen Kane not winning and losing to How Green Was My Valley. In this case, though, Heart of Darkness is probably going to lose to Gone with the Wind, because Gone with the Wind still exists. I just changed some of the casting around. Anyways, then we have Nymph Errant. There was consideration for a Nymph Errant adaptation in the 1930s. But it wasn't made because the Americans didn't actually like that musical. It gets made here. So is Mary Martin. She plays the Nymph Errant. Then we have The Blue Lagoon. You remember, that movie starring Brooke Shields, the one that I really, really hate?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so it's this novel that movie is based off of. There was going to be an adaptation. Oh, why are you so loud? There was going to be an adaptation of that in the... What the... There was going to be an adaptation of that in the 1930s starring Margaret Lockwood, and then it wasn't made. So I decided to have it be made in this timeline because... I don't know. I decided to make my life more difficult instead of not doing that. Then we have The Adventures of Don Juan, which was originally going to be made in like in our timeline did end up getting made in like the 1940s or 50s. I think it was like the 1950s. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head right now. But it was originally going to be made in 1939, starring Errol Flynn. He ended up starring in it like 10 years down the line, but he wanted to originally make it in 1939, and then they didn't because of budgetary reasons. So he does, in this timeline, star in The Adventures of Don Juan in 1939. Then we have The Circus is on Parade, which is an adaptation of Jumbo, a circus movie musical that premiered on Broadway. I needed some movie for the Marx Brothers in 1939, since in this timeline they go independent, whereas in our timeline they don't. Here they do. So I needed to give them some movie in 1939. So I gave them The Circus is on Parade. It's considered like one of their weakest films. Then we have Little Ava, which is an adaptation of the Little Ava novel, and it's a highly controversial book for very obvious reasons. Very racist. But I needed to give Shirley Temple a movie in 1939, and I needed to give her a musical specifically in 1939. And Little Ava just seemed to make sense because of the fact that this was 1939, and it was the same year Gone with the Wind came out. So Little Ava felt like a good movie to come out at that time. Plus, it still gives Bill Robinson something to do, since I threw away Little Rebel and Little Colonel, so he couldn't dance with her in those movies. He dances with her in Little Ava instead. For similar reasons, we have Little House on the Prairie, which is also 1939. I needed another Shirley Temple movie. She made like 5 a year at the height of her career. They were massive box office successes, all of them, because everyone loved Shirley Temple. I needed to give her something this year, because while she's not as exploited in this timeline, she's still exploited, and I needed to give her something. So Little House on the Prairie. It made sense. Then we have Tessa the Storm Country. I remember I was having that big debate in my mind about like what movie to give Dorothy Dell. I decided to give her Tessa the Storm Country. She made a Tessa the Storm Country movie in 1939 because I needed to give her something, and it was No, she wasn't the racist one. The racism was a different thing. No. Dorothy Dell was, remember, I was deciding whether or not to have her star in the Alfred Hitchcock movie. And then I decided not to, because I decided that I wanted to give her her own movie, and I wanted to keep Hitchcock at Gaumont British for a couple of years. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Anyways, I decided to give her Dorothy Dell Tessa the Storm Country because it's the 25th anniversary of Tessa the Storm Country, and it was a major success, that movie, so I figured it makes sense to give Dorothy Dell something like that then, at the height of her career in this timeline, since she's dead in our timeline. Then we have the Iliad, which is the Fleischer Brothers' second film. I already told you a lot about the Fleischer Brothers. Remember, Jiminy Cricket voices Ares, because I think that's funny. And, of course, Popeye voices voices Achilles. Jack Mercer is the voice for Popeye. He voices Achilles because I think that's funny. And also, it does actually make logical sense that Jack Mercer would voice Achilles, since he was at the time probably the Fleischer Brothers' biggest star on their shorts, since he voiced the character, like their biggest character. We also have, of course, the voice for Betty Boop in this film. We also have the voice of Snow White in this movie, fun fact. She voices Hecuba, Adriana Castellati, because in our timeline, her career completely floundered after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because Walt Disney refused to let her do like anything else because he wanted to keep the magic of her voice. And so he refused to let her do anything else, basically, even though she got lots of offers to do other things. But he refused to sign her out to any other things because magic, who cares about her career? Magic. But in this timeline, since I'm killing Walt Disney so early and his career is in shambles right now, she gets to do other things. So she gets to star in a Fleischer Brother film. Then we have The Jungle Girl, which is the Van Buren film. I needed a Van Buren film in 1939 because I need to give them something to compete with the Fleischer Brothers. Rima the Jungle Girl makes sense because in this timeline, the Van Burens made a Jane adaptation, Jane being a very raunchy comic from the 1930s. And so in this timeline, Van Buren, who was struggling heavily, needed something to compete with the Fleischer Brothers, and giving them something more adult-oriented felt like the right move for them, because it would have set them apart from Disney and Fleischer. I mean, Fleischer wasn't kid-oriented, but it still wasn't adult-oriented, you know what I mean? So Rima the Jungle Girl made sense then, because it's also a comic that, well, actually it was a book, but it's also something like very adult-oriented, where they could just put a pretty woman in the cartoon and it would work. It does make sense for Van Buren because they did do this adventure film with Joan Lowell in the 1930s, where it was basically like a pseudo-documentary starring Joan Lowell as herself. So it then makes sense that she would then voice the character of Rima in The Jungle Girl. Then we have Zishi, which is a Chinese film at the time from Bu Wang Kang. He wanted to do 4 films on the 4 beauties of China, but then the Sino-Japanese War began and he couldn't because half of his actors fled the country. In this timeline, they don't do that because I think it would be interesting if he got to make his Four Beauties film. Does it make political sense for this to happen? No, but I think it'd be cool anyways. So he's making it. Zishi is considered the best of the four. That being said, Wang Xiaochun, which is the other of the Four Beauties films he makes it in 1939, was the more financially successful one. So yeah, then we have Pocahontas in 1939. Alexander Korda wanted to do a Pocahontas film in 1939 starring Merle Oberon. Merle Oberon, fun fact, not Native American. She still gets to be Pocahontas in this timeline though, because that's what Alexander Korda wanted. And who am I to argue with Alexander Korda? I could have found a Native... Huh?
The author.
Yeah, well, yes, okay, I get that, but like that's what he wanted. You know? It's 1939. It is what it is, unfortunately. Anyways, Merle Oberon gets to play Pocahontas in this timeline. Give her something to do. Laurence Olivier is John Smith, fun fact. In this timeline. So yeah, there's a Pocahontas film in 1939. Also, then we have The War of the Worlds. Alfred Hitchcock movie. He wanted to make a War of the Worlds movie. I decided to give it to him, and I decided to keep it a Gaumont British. It stars Conrad Veidt as Dr. George Forster. Because I love Conrad Veidt, and he was at Gaumont British at the time. I also needed to give James Cagney a film in 1939 because in this timeline he doesn't go back to Warner Brothers, he stays with Grand National Pictures. So I needed to give him something. I didn't want to give him one where he plays another gangster, so instead he plays an assassin in this movie. He's a murderer. He kills people for money, but he's not a gangster, he's an assassin. Still sort of in the same line, but a little different enough to give him some more leeway with his performance. Anyways, he's going to star in an adaptation of A Gun for Sale. In our timeline, we do get a Gun for Sale adaptation in 1941 called Lady for Hire. In this timeline, it's in 1939 at Grand National Pictures with James Cagney. It also has Louis Brooks, by the way, who retires in our timeline like 10 years before this. But in this timeline, she got to make the Public Enemy film with James Cagney as well. So this is like them reuniting, and it continues her successful career. It's good for her. I want her to have nice things too. And then we have, finally, the last film I had to make up for 1939, When Worlds Collide. Cecil B. DeMille wanted to do a When Worlds Collide adaptation in the 1930s. In this timeline, he does get to do that. He gets to make his When Worlds Collide film. And so because there's two massive successful sci-fi films in 1939, that means there's going to be a bunch of sci-fi films I have to make up in the 1940s. I am in pain.